Hi, welcome to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge. And this week, we want to talk about the importance of fathers in the family. I think the reason why this dialogue is sometimes uncomfortable or awkward for some people is there's a lot of charge around the role of the father, of whether or not there's a father needed in the family, exactly what that looks like, and how fathers are now seen in culture and society. There's been a huge sort of pendulum swing from one direction to the other where in, say, court cases, it's not uncommon for fathers to get, pretty shafted in family court. And there's a feeling that that's deserved. So we just kind of wanted to not in a super preachy way, but just sort of in more of a explore the topic.
Yeah.
More look at why, is the role of the father imperative? Is it super important? Why would it be important if it is? And maybe some arguments, go in both directions.
And I also see this kind of, there's almost like a reclamation of young fathers right now. They're like, oh, hey, I'm a dad, and this is interesting, and I've got some things I feel about this. This is cool. I like being a dad. I have an identity around this now. And it's almost like our generation, maybe some people a little younger than us, weren't handed this mantle of fatherhood necessarily. But then they had a kid, and all of a sudden, oh, I'm a dad, and I got to do something about this. And where does that fit in? How do I fit in this? Because I don't really necessarily have a clear example of how the modern world has room for a father like myself. Does that make sense? It's kind of this weird, I don't have a script for this, but yet I'm a dad and I've got to somehow make my way in the world.
Yeah, well, and I think one of the reasons why there's not as strong a script is there's a lot of people who grew up without a dad.
Yeah.
So that's number one. And number two, I think the way fatherhood looks now is different than in the previous generations.
Yeah.
I think fathers take on a very different role than they used to because of how culture has changed. In a family where both parents are working, that's going to change the dynamic of the family.
Yes.
In a situation where a father isn't just, say, the disciplinarian, in a situation where maybe he works from home, and so he's able to engage with his children a lot more. All of that is going to alter the dynamic of fatherhood. So I think that's another big piece of the conversation is what does fatherhood look like now as opposed to before?
Yeah.
And you're right. I don't think that a lot of men feel like they were given a strong script for what fatherhood is.
I love the show Mad Men on AMC. It's coming up in its last season now, but it's about these ad agencies in the 1960s and the men and women who worked in them and kind of what life was like in New York City and, by a broader context, the United States during that time period between 1960 and 1970. And it's really interesting to see kind of the caricature concepts and the way that fathers are portrayed in this show. And I think it's pretty accurate based on stories and history that I can understand, that dad was kind of seen as a breadwinner who went to work and made the money and brought home the paycheck, and when he got home, he cracked open a can of beer, he sat on the couch, he watched some television, he may pat his kids on the head, and then he goes into his study or whatever later that night, or he goes to bed later that night, and that's kind of his involvement in the family in a lot of ways. And then he might take them in the station wagon on vacation once a year. But that was kind of like dad's, or to a ball game, something like that, a couple times a month, maybe something of that nature. And then they're showing some divorces and how dads are interacting with their kids, and it's this interesting kind of traditional way that men and fathers are presented during this time period that I don't think exists anymore. And I think, though, we still have a lot of culture, rules, and ideas based on this older view of what fatherhood and what, masculinity in the family might have looked like. And so it's this really interesting time period of kind of old ways that things were with the new ways that things are. And I don't think people are necessarily looking at what's going on now. They're kind of taking the past and combining it with, the future and trying to make up some kind of new way of seeing the world. In some ways.
Yeah, well, and what's funny about looking at fatherhood in the 60s, we just watched a documentary on World War II.
Yeah.
And I don't know how that entire generation of men who were in World War II, I don't know how they just were not completely batshit insane from PTSD, from post-traumatic stress disorder. I don't know how an entire generation of people didn't just like go completely off their nut. They were in situations and contexts and experiences that would break anybody. You know what I mean? It's like we're watching these situations happen, or these stories unfold of, the men who were in the Navy over in Japan and men who were in the Marines over in, Europe. And I don't know how they survived. I don't know how their brain survived. So, these men would have been parents in the 50s and 60s. And so it completely makes sense that a generation of men, the greatest generation, they would have been the ones who fought in World War II, the greatest generation. And they had been through, basically...
They grew up during the Great Depression.
Yeah, they grew up during the Great Depression. If they were in, the middle part of the country, they had the Dust Bowl to contend with. They were alive during the First War. Like, there was a lot of stuff that happened and went down in their lives. That they are the example of what I think of as that old proverb, the curse of, or not the curse, but the attempted blessing, may you live in boring times or uninteresting times. They lived in an extremely interesting time, unfortunately for them. And so you could see how, at the point where they were fathers, how that would have all of that compressed. Right? Like, how, first of all, even if you're in a time period that honors and welcomes it, working through emotions, which they weren't in a situation that honored, and welcomed going through an experience emotionally. Even if you are, that would have been a tough gig. But they weren't in a situation that honored the individual emotion. And so there's all this stuff compressed. And you could see why, the 1950s may have been the height of domestic violence. You could see why there would have been so much rage in the 50s and 60s while people were raising their children. And so, all these stereotypes of the missing father or the patriarch that just disciplined his kids or just couldn't stand children to, make noise. I get it. I totally get that. I get how if I had gone through World War II and a little kid was screaming 10 years later, that might be something that is just more than I could handle.
Yeah.
Yeah, I could totally get that.
Well, and this idea that I did a lot during a war for all of us, and now I kind of just want to come home from work and know that dinner's on the table and read my newspaper, watch my TV program, and not really be bothered a lot. And I'm not saying that this is what all fathers, this is not what happened, but this is kind of the stereotype we see in movie after movie, television program after television program, and talking and reading about people during this time period. This was something that wasn't out of the norm for the dad to be kind of go to your room, I don't want to hear from you. Kind of this gruff, caring, providing, but very distanced person. I mean, that's kind of the image we get of fathers in the 1950s and 60s. Whether or not that was exactly true for everybody, obviously not. And that's the image. Their
children would have been boomers, and if you talk to baby boomers, that's not an uncommon relationship that they had with their father.
Yeah.
Kind of a distanced, relationship with their dad. I think that was not uncommon. So now you get these baby boomers who are growing up, right, and getting a voice in the 60s. And you get, what was happening in the 60s, lots of tumultuous cultural change. The second wave of feminism came up. And then there was this concept that was birthed out of second wave feminism where the dad wasn't really necessary. There wasn't, he was more not necessarily completely making the statement, but there was almost like an implication that the man was basically a sperm donor.
Yeah.
And so there is, we're like two generations remote. My parents are baby boomers. Your parents are baby boomers. And then, of course, our kids are, I don't know what our kids are because we're kind of straddling between Generation X and the millennials. And our kids will be whatever term they give to the next generation. But that said, we're sort of two generations removed from that, PTSD batch that so influenced their children, in particular, potentially their daughters, to see the man as, maybe the father as a patriarch that doesn't need to be there, maybe a disciplinarian that was not appropriate. And so they taught their children that informed their relationships with their men, their husbands. It informed how they were going to teach their sons to behave. It informed how they were going to teach their daughters to, see men. And not that second wave feminism was, wrong or bad or anything. There was a lot of good stuff that came from it. However, it felt like there was more of a chasm created between men and women during that time period, as opposed to a coming together for understanding. So now, here we are, we're straddling Generation X and millennials, Generation Y. And now we see a whole batch of fathers coming up going, okay, so my dad left when I was a kid, or my parents divorced when I was young and I only spent a certain amount of time with my dad, or my dad was around but my mom really wore the pants in the family, or whatever the narrative or story is. Or
my dad was the really strong, masculine kind of patriarchal presence, and I don't feel like that's me. Like that's not necessarily me.
And my mom just did whatever he wanted her to do.
Yeah, I don't feel like I've got that swagger and commanding presence that just orders people around.
Yeah, exactly. Like the story that our father, the stories of our fathers, for those of us who were raised with a father, they were baby boomers and they were trying to deal with whatever they were dealing with. And so now you get this whole generation of men who, as we mentioned, don't necessarily feel like they have a strong script, right? Like they don't really feel like they're that patriarch necessarily, the disciplinarian that wants children to just be seen and not heard, or just be like instantaneously obedient. Or they didn't maybe have a model of a father. The father was gone or missing from the situation, and so they don't really have a father to look to. Or maybe their father was, not... just whatever their father was not necessarily the model that they want to emulate. And it feels like not everybody experiences this. Obviously, we're talking gross generalizations. However, it feels like you said, there's a reclamation of fatherhood. There's a reclamation of what fatherhood and true masculinity should look like.
Which in a lot of ways is kind of cool because we get to reinvent. We don't have to necessarily, our generation, my generation, doesn't have to necessarily follow the 1960s script of what fatherhood looks like. We get to reinvent some of it. But I think there's a lot of lost ways. And I don't think culture helps much. I look at like television advertisements at the Super Bowl and kind of the portrayal of men in a lot of popular media. And it's kind of like, it's almost like men are children that have to be managed. Even like a lot of like, if you look at an advertisement on, it's like men just want to drink beer and they're kind of like small children. And then the woman at the house has to kind of manage not only the kids, but also the dad who can't function. He's like functionally retarded for some reason. He can't, oh, honey. And then she comes in and fixes something or does something because he's kind of just like the kids.
Like the stereotypical Homer Simpson character.
Yeah. And it's kind of like, oh, okay. Like, is that really how everybody sees dads and men in the role of like family and parents? And why? And like, really? Do I come off like that as a dad? Like, it's kind of disconcerting and it makes me feel like, wow, people don't respect like the fact that I'm wanting to show up and be present for my kids. It's like, well, you're just an idiot and you're not gonna, all you're good for is, maybe child support or whatever, right. Like you get what I'm saying? Like it's kind of this idea that men can't function in the world of some sort.
And you can see that that's a major pendulum swing the other direction, because if you look at the advertisements in the 50s and 60s, that's how women were portrayed. Yes. Women were portrayed as children.
Yes.
That needed a firm hand. In fact, there are ads, if you look them up, like old sexist ads, there are ads where like men are spanking their wives because of a bad buying decision they made.
Yes.
So it's really what it is it's turned something on its head, and it's meant to pull people out of a frame. I think that was, advertising, the best advertising pulls you out of a frame pulls you out of how you see reality long enough to be open to a new concept.
Sure.
And so I think advertising and media has swung the pendulum from the wife is a child that needs a firm hand to the man, the husband and father is a child that needs a woman to come save him. And both characterizations are grossly inaccurate, right? Like, or if they are accurate, is that the kind of society that we want to perpetuate?
Well, yeah, and I was going to say that us men sometimes don't do ourselves a favor by, cloistering into a room and playing video games for hours at a time, or behaving in ways that are immature or not stepping up to the plate. I mean, there are a lot of dudes that don't do what's needed, especially if they're a dad. Hey, step up to the plate, be a dad, be present, be here with your kids. There's a lot of guys that are too, but there are some men who don't make this, they do play into this kind of stereotype of I'm just a kid, I'm just going to goof around even into my adulthood, and I'm not going to man up and take responsibility for my children, my family, my presence in the world coming to this. But I think you hit on it. It's like, do we want to live in a society where that's how we see ourselves and that's how we see the world around us? I personally don't want to.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so the question is, okay, so what does a man do in that dynamic? Like, and it being sensitive to the fact that we have a completely different, we have a new emerging concept of family. That's basically what the TV show Modern Family is all about. The modern family is not the traditional Ozzie and Harriet family anymore. I mean, there are plenty of families that are, two parents, a man and a woman, and 2.5 children, and that's the life they're living. So there's plenty of that still. However, not most, but there's a lot of people who don't live that formula. They're in blended families, where, the children are from a previous marriage, or, you've got siblings that are step siblings. You've got, houses that are no longer, the traditional heterosexual parent. You've got a homosexual couple that's raising a child. And there's lots of different flavors to it now. So it's almost like the conversation of what does the mom role do, or what does the mom do and what does the dad do? It's almost like that feels a little archaic for our time period.
Absolutely.
And I think that that's probably one of the reasons why the dialogue doesn't really seem to go very far, unless you're talking on, like a traditional Christian, focus on the family style. They're still getting that dialogue going. They're still talking about that. And for an audience that maybe doesn't necessarily identify with the theology that comes along with it, then they sort of throw the conversation out as just being a part of that full theology. When really the conversation should still be there, and also give space and room to the fact that it doesn't look the same. So then what's the conversation? If it's not just a traditional mom, traditional dad, traditional family, how does the conversation morph to be relevant to our modern, times, to the culture that we're dealing with, and also not lose what the mom does for the family and what the dad role does for the family?
Yeah, and I think it's really a conversation about energies. And we've talked about this offline, Mm-hmm. There's obviously going to be, anywhere you are in the world, there's going to be a feminine energy and a masculine energy that's brought to the table. And sometimes those aren't brought by the traditional roles you would think would bring them. Sometimes a woman can bring a masculine energy, a man can bring a feminine energy, or a man can bring a feminine, another man can bring a masculine. Like, there's all sorts of different interplays between these energies. And I think that energy interplay transcends a gender role in a sense. Now, I'm not an expert in gender studies by any means, or anything like that. However, I do have a sense of this masculine feminine dichotomy, this polarization that I think is healthy. I don't think you want all masculine energy or all feminine energy. I think it's the interplay, and we have both energies inside of us. We're both masculine and feminine, whether we're men or women. And I think the interplay of those energies is what the conversation actually is about.
Right. So basically what you're saying is remove it from the way the conversation has been approached up till now, which is the mom and the dad, and look a layer underneath it to the foundational level, which is the masculine energy and the feminine energy, and what do those do for the family dynamic?
Exactly. And I think a healthy family, this is my belief. My belief is a healthy family dynamic has both energies represented in harmony with each other. Kind of this almost like a harmony, but at the same time a tension. And I think between the tension and the harmony is a perfect balance of both energies being balanced together. And there's kind of this, they have a natural conflict, and they also have a natural simpatico. and they both are present at the same time. And when one gets way out of balance from the other, that's, I think, when a lot of tension, a lot of trouble happens.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I would say that interplay is because it's so ancient. Because that's pretty much the model that we've been seeing since the time of mammals, right? Since the time we started becoming social. The masculine feminine energy is so ancient and such ancient programming that it's going to impact us now.
Yeah.
Even if it looks a little different than we're used to, I think we pretty much instinctively understand that interplay of the masculine and feminine energy is something that's truly important. And when we deny that, right, like going, well, I don't need a man in my life, or I don't need a woman in my life, what we're really saying is I don't need a masculine energy, or I don't need a feminine energy in my life. And that's, I don't think that's realistic.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to look the traditional way. It doesn't, like, if you're a woman, having a masculine energy in your life doesn't mean that you have to go get married to a man. However, where is the masculine energy going to come for your children?
Yeah.
I think that's closer to the conversation.
And I think for single parents, I was a single dad for about 2 years, from the time I separated from my first wife until the time I met you, and we entered into a relationship. I was a single dad with 2 boys, very young. I think they were like 3 and 1 at the time, and then they 4 and 2. But when I had my 2 boys with me as a father, I didn't have a complementary energy when they were in my presence in my home that I had set up. I had to play both roles. And because they were so young, I ended up skewing more toward the nurturing feminine energy than I did more of the parameter securing masculine energy. And it was very difficult to balance both. As a single parent, if you're listening, you know what this is like. You can't authentically play both roles very easily. One of them is going to lend itself to the age of your kids and the circumstance you're in. And because my children were young, they needed a lot of nurturing, a lot of like boo-boo kissing, a lot of like hugs and cuddles. And I had to play more of a nurturing, more feminine energied role in kind of caretaking for them because of their age, because of the circumstance I was in. And I bet as a single parent, if you're listening, you have some of this experience where maybe you're a single mom and you're raising a teenage son. You're having to be more of the disciplinarian, more of that, securing the parameter, letting your child know that it's safe out there and there are rules and there are boundaries, and you have to give up some of your nurturing ability or your nurturing sense to kind of quote unquote lay down the law in this way and secure the parameter for your child. And so that's a difficult balance for you as a single parent, I'm sure.
You keep referencing and hinting at it, but I think it'd be really good right now to define what we mean when we say feminine energy and masculine energy.
Yeah. So how I perceive it, we see feminine and masculine energies as the feminine is very movement oriented, very creative. It's almost like a dance, an expression. It's free form and movement. There's lots of expression and movement around. And a masculine energy is very still. It's very present. It's very kind of securing a parameter and keeping a fence up to keep predator thoughts, feelings, things without nature out. They're both needed in order to kind of interplay with each other. For someone to be able to let down their guard enough to dance and express themselves, they need to know that the parameter is secure. And in order for someone to be able to secure the parameter, for an energy to secure the parameter and to kind of be still in the moment, they need to understand that there is expression still happening because they're not being able to express. They're holding a secure spot, a secure state.
Yeah. Well, and a lot of this came from a fairly cursory study that I did, and I actually think you did too. I mean, I don't know how cursory. Yours is a little deeper than mine, actually. You've studied masculine and femininity a little more than I have. But I did a fairly cursory study of David Data's stuff. Mm-hmm. And David Data talks about the masculine and feminine energy. He's what I have read of his and what I've seen of his is brilliant, and I'd like to go further down that rabbit's hole. But what I kind of understood from it is that this is ancient programming, and the masculine energy creates a container. Like, you're basically talking about securing that perimeter, making it a safe place for the feminine energy to dance and express. And I think that's why we get so hypnotized by the feminine energy. That's why everybody just talks about how beautiful females are. the form is beautiful, but the dance is beautiful too. That sort of fluid motion that women sort of express. I think a lot of stereotypes about women are not necessarily so much about, they'll talk about the stereotype of women being like really emotional, my wife is always talking to me and she always just wants to converse and I just want to be quiet. Like a lot of these stereotypes come from the woman's energy. The more feminine the energy, the more emotion she is, the more she's dancing around. And the more masculine an energy is, the more still it is, the more of that container they create. And it's the polarity of the two that creates such strong attraction between these two energies. Women are hypnotically beautiful in their dance. And I think the container is created so that men can, or the masculine energy can appreciate that hypnotic beauty that women have in their dance. And I think women, when they're seeking a mate, rest into that still container because they know that container gives them a safe space to be that, that beautiful dancing creature. And again, we're talking about energies. We're not talking about men and women. Though men and women have a tendency to show up with, men show up with a masculine and women show up with a feminine. That is common. However, those can be reversed. Mm-hmm. You can have men that have a strong feminine energy and they have that hypnotic, they're just as hypnotizing. And then you can have women that have that stillness to them that create a container. So the energy doesn't necessarily imply the gender, though there is a strong correlation between the two.
Yeah. And I think probably, so we originally started talking about fatherhood and fathers kind of in a modern context and what that looks like. I would venture to say in most cases, when a father shows up for his children, because obviously father is a designation of maleness. I mean, that's biologically speaking.
Totally, yeah.
Typically, in most cases, a father's going to show up and have a proclivity to and also be expected to show up with a masculine energy as a father. And I know that's a big assumption to make because there's a lot of fathers that do bring that feminine energied space. But I think that there are a lot of fathers who can show up in a more masculine way, but they don't have a sense of permission, a sense of it's okay to show up with a masculine energy, because I think there's been a little bit of, and I don't want to step on toes, but I think there's been a little bit of a demonization of masculinity in and of itself, as if it's wrong or bad when it shows up. And I don't think that's necessarily accurate. I think if it's run rampant and it's not tempered by also a feminine polarized, a polar opposite feminine energy, I think you're going to have some problems, obviously. If it's just all masculinity, it's going to be, it's overbearing and there's no dance, there's no expression. It's all just lockdown and security,
and because most of history has been highly favoring masculine control and power, I think unfortunately, our generation is experiencing the backlash of many thousands of years of, masculine domination and a lot of pain that's gone along with it. And so, the sins of the fathers are visited upon, the children, or on the sons. And so I think our generation is kind of dealing with this sort of like, okay, well, but I'm not an evil patriarch, right? Yeah. Like I'm not an evil controlling patriarch. I'm just a dude who's trying to figure out how to be a good dad or, how to show up in the world. And I feel like, just being a male is somehow, wrong or bad because of a lot of things that I've seen in the past, and also are still going on the planet, by the way. Men still basically run the planet, and there's a lot of places in which they do it quite poorly. And so you can kind of understand why there would still be this sentiment. And yet, this fantasy of a female-run planet, right? Like if the feminine was just in control, we'd have nothing but peace. I think that's just completely unrealistic. That's totally unrealistic. A exclusively feminine-run planet would not be filled with peace any more than an exclusively female-run anything is nothing but peace and kumbaya. That's just not how it works. What works beautifully is the balance between the two. And the stronger and more mature and more developed these energies are, regardless of which gender possesses them, but the stronger and more mature they are, that's when you really get a sense of peace, right? You get a sense of motion, you get a sense of movement and nurturing and nourishment and all that beautiful stuff that the feminine energy brings. And you also get a sense of calmness and peace and safety and security that the masculine energy brings as well. And it's the combination of the two that I think produce really well-adjusted children.
And I don't think one person brings all of the energy of one thing. Again, I think that, as a man, as a father, I have the ability to bring a feminine energy and a masculine energy with my children. And I think that understanding that I don't have to be the Mad Men style dad, I can come and I can pick up my daughter and kiss her on the knee when she's hurt. I can bring a nurturing sensibility to my presence. But at the same time, demanding respect for my children and demanding that we have a container of peace and security in the home is also something I can bring to the table. And you can as well, as the feminine, person in the relationship. You can also bring a container of presence and stillness and also nurturing. And I think it's that dance, that balance. If both of us are in a masculine space during the day, we're going to have some power struggle most likely. And if both of us are in a feminine space, we're going to be dancing around all the time. And it's the yin yang of, if you're in a feminine space, I need to be in a masculine space, kind of to balance that out. And sometimes we'll reverse roles throughout the day, interacting with kids.
Yeah, to respond to the context and what's needed.
Yeah, like something might trigger you and you're like, I can't, this is so, you're coming down hard on the kids. And I'll respond to that by going into the other space, basically. And then you'll do the same with me.
Right.
And that interplay, I think, is really important.
So to kind of land the plane on all of this, because I know that this can get really muddied really quick, this whole conversation. And I think it's because it is so triggering, right? Like there's a lot of triggers that end up happening around this kind of dialogue for people. And in particular, if you're a single parent, then there's probably lots of triggers that are happening and like, oh, well, you mean I'm not good enough, right? Like I'm just one person. How can I be both things all the time? Like I'm not good enough. And the truth is that like children have been raised in extraordinarily terrible situations and come out okay. And some children have been raised in great situations and come out thoroughly evil. And some kids have been raised in great situations and have become amazing, and been raised in terrible situations and come out terrible. So it's kind of a numbers game. It's all of the factors of the system, right? It's the upbringing, it's the genetics and the predisposition of the child, and it's the context. I mean, there's so many different components in, what ends up making the child well-adjusted or ill-adjusted. There are so many different components to it that it fundamentally is kind of a numbers game. And yet we always want to stack the deck in our favor, if at all possible. So when you're looking at deck stacking, if you are a single parent that has absolutely zero help, regardless of whether or not you're a father or a mother, and you've got nobody in your life that can help balance it, that doesn't mean that your kids are going to grow up ill-adjusted. That's not what that means. However, if you can identify what your predominant energy is, if you're a woman, if your predominant energy is feminine, then that's great. If your predominant energy is masculine, right, just kind of watch yourself and how you behave, then ask yourself, how can I help balance that out? How can I find the other as an influence in life? Could it be a parent, one of my parents as a grandparent? Can it be a very good friend who has a relationship, has a mentor relationship with my children? Can you go to Big Brothers, Big Sisters, right? And find somebody who can help bring the other to the relationship as well, to the dynamic? That's mostly what it is. And I think the other side of this is the predominant, or not predominant, excuse me, this concept that the father is not necessary, or rather the masculine energy as represented by males is not necessary. I think that needs to be reevaluated.
I would agree.
I think that that's pretty much the big piece of why I wanted to talk about this today. Is it's not that that's necessarily evil or wrong, but I think we need to reevaluate where we got that idea, the etymology of it, and whether or not we're truly onto something, or whether or not we're simply being reactionary.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think that we see, in my experience, the court systems, for example, are a little behind the times, I think, of what's currently happening. I think they're they're still responding to a fatherhood that existed 20, 30 years ago. And so there were some decisions made by the court, when I was there with my child custody issues, that I don't think were made with a sense of awareness of what's happening now. It was kind of like this template from 30 years ago they were making decisions based on, of what fathers looked like back then. How much child support, how many days you get with the kids, things like this.
Whether or
this
not
idea.
It's way more important for them to be with the mom or the dad,
Yeah.
and how that precedent is going to be carried out through their entire lives.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think this, there's this. So I think that needs to be updated in some of the ways we move through the world legally and technically and all that. But I think culturally, I guess for me, the message I'd give to you as a dad listening is don't give up thinking that, you're wrong or bad if you want to show up as a dad with a strong masculine presence. There's nothing wrong with that. It's okay to show up with a strong masculine presence. Don't be an a-hole about it.
Right.
Don't come out like a Mad Men style dad. But that strong masculine presence is important, and it's not something to apologize or backpedal from or feel wrong or bad about. It's okay to bring that to the table. In fact, there's evidence suggests that your children will respond well to it and become well adjusted because you're bringing something that is missing in the world in a lot of ways. We don't have a culture that's open to that, and in fact kind of pushes that away a lot, that energy, that masculine presence, that masculine energy. Again, with kindness and sincerity,
right.
not with domineering presence, but a presence of position and, self-authority.
Yeah.
As a dad, bring that to the table. Don't apologize for it. And temper that with kindness and compassion and responsibility. Step up to the plate. And you're going to see your kids and your family life and all that, I believe, for the better.
Yeah, and I would say if I had a message to mothers, it's easy to throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. It's easy to see masculinity as being sort of this whole clump of oppression that women have been on the receiving end of for so long and are still on the receiving end of in this in the world today. It's easy to see that as being an expression of masculinity when really that's an expression of immature masculinity. True, authentic, developed masculine energy is not going to behave in an oppressive way. So to resist all forms of masculinity is it's not really doing you any favors. It's just I would say that it's a matter of getting good at identifying true masculinity as opposed to an immature version of dominance that that men sometimes default to because they don't really know what true masculinity is either. So try not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Try not to throw out authentic, true masculine expressions, developed, mature masculine expressions. Try not to assume that is the same thing as oppressive, domineering masculine presence, and look for it. Like, really get good at identifying it and invite it into your world, invite it into your children's world. Because I think it is again ancient programming, right? Like, it's not a matter of whether or not it's good or bad. It has, in my opinion, has nothing to do with ethics or morality. It has everything to do with what's effective and what works. And because we are programmed from so long ago to see this polarization relationship as being part of what makes us well-adjusted, it's still relevant, to today's context.
Absolutely. Want to hear from you? Come over to personalityhacker.com, leave a comment, question. Also, subscribe to this podcast. We'd love to have you be a regular listener. I mean, you probably have listened to a couple episodes. Just go ahead, hit the button, subscribe. Join us every week for this podcast. And if you really want to go down the rabbit hole, we have a free test over at personalityhacker.com. You can start getting your personality diagnosed, your preferences, and then start going down the rabbit hole of understanding how you can use your personality for personal development and growth. I'm Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
This has been the Personality Hacker Podcast. We'll talk to you next time.